Brown bears are fascinating animals. Adult bears can eat hundreds of pounds of food in a day, and all bears must eat a year's worth of food in fewer than 6 months to survive winter hibernation. Preparation for hibernation guides much of what bears do in the summer, but not all bears make a living in the same way. Why are there differences in the ways bears look and behave? Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Fitz, and I'm the resident naturalist with Explore.org. And joining me today is Ranger Brooklyn White, who works for Katmai National Park in Alaska. We're here to discuss the inherited and acquired traits in brown bears and how those differences reflect the bear's experiences and behaviors, a lot of the things that you can see on the bear cams, and also what that might mean for their survival. So we'll be introducing some of the basic differences between inherited and acquired traits and pairing that with information about a few of the bears that we'll see on the bear cams at Brooks River. And teachers, be sure to download the curriculum that accompanies this broadcast at explore.org/education. Look for that link, or look for the link of the brown bear lesson plan on that page. Brooklyn, thanks so much for joining me today. Always great to speak with you.
Yes, I'm excited to be here.
We got a lot of questions from students, so thank you to everybody who submitted questions in advance for us. But I do have one question for Brooklyn right off the top of the broadcast here. How excited are you for this year's Fat Bear Week?
I love Fat Bear Week. It's probably my favorite week of the year. And this year in particular is going to be so special. The bears have been able to get so fat because of just the amount of salmon that we've seen this year in the river. So I think it's going to be the weightiest Fat Bear Week yet. But it's
I
always
think it can be.
exciting to, absolutely. But it's always exciting to get to celebrate how much work these bears put into getting fat. And that's really what Fat Bear Week is all about. Being able to recognize this accomplishment as they are, working to put on those pounds to survive winter hibernation. So Fat Bear Week allows us to, pair bears up against each other and see who will ultimately come out on top. It's kind of set up like a March Madness competition. And so bears will battle and people will get to vote and select the bear that they think is the fattest or that they think has had the most impressive weight gain over the season. And ultimately, one bear will emerge on top.
I'm looking forward to it as well. And Azzy from 6th grade actually asked, what is Fat Bear Week? So Azzy, I hope Brooklyn answered your question there. But maybe, Brooklyn, we need to get into some of the basics of the bears at Brooks River and talk about where the river is, for instance. So can you share with us a little bit about Katmai National Park and Brooks River, and specifically where it is and why do bears come to Brooks River?
Absolutely. So Katmai National Park and Preserve is located in southwestern Alaska, towards the top of the Aleutian Arm. It's very remote. It's not accessible by driving there. It's off of the road system. So you have to use a boat or a plane to get there. But the Brooks River is located in a really small part of the overall park. The park is 4.1 million acres. So Brooks River is located in one of the only developed areas in the park that we call Brooks Camp. And the river itself is only 1.5 miles long, but it attracts bears there year after year. But there are some very special things about the river that bring bears back. And truly, it is because of the amount of salmon that make their way every single year. It has a very healthy run of salmon. Even this year, we saw almost 800,000 salmon that came through its waters. And of course, because salmon are the bear's primary food source, that's going to bring those bears back year after year. The bears that we have are coastal brown bears. And Mariana from Columbia Elementary was asking about what kind of bears do we see in Katmai National Park. So these bears are the same species as the grizzly bear, but they have a primary difference. These bears have access to coastal food resources like salmon, clams, or mussels. So they tend to be more comfortable having other bears in their space bubbles because they don't have to fight as hard over other food sources. Maylene asked from Miranda School, have grizzly or brown bears ever been seen in Katmai? So, because we do have the same species, grizzly bears and coastal brown bears, you could say that you've seen a grizzly bear when you've been to Katmai, but they're going to have just a different temperament, and again, are going to be more comfortable having other bears around them. Now, I did hear a story about a black bear being spotted along the coast of Katmai, but it was being chased by another brown bear that was pushing it out of the area. So we don't have black bears as a primary mammal that we see in Katmai National Park. Elise from Lakes Elementary was asking about how the bears get to Brooks Falls. Where do they come from? And we know that bears can travel over 50 miles to try to get to the Brooks River to fish. We are doing even more research to try and figure out maybe how far these bears actually travel, and if they travel over some of the coastal mountains to get to the Brooks River. So we'll see and hopefully learn in the future how hard they work to ultimately get to the Brooks River to fish. Anthony from Columbia Elementary asked how many types of fish the bears eat. Now, the primary food source for our bears in Katmai, but specifically at the Brooks River, are sockeye salmon and silver salmon. We see that first run of sockeye typically in July, and that is that primary food source for our bears. But we do see a smaller run of silver salmon in August and in September. So the bears that are feeding on fish that aren't as spawned out right now are probably going to be those silver salmon. But if you see a bear that has a bright red fish with green on its tail and towards its head, that's going to be one of the sockeye salmon that is more spawned out. Bears may also grab a rainbow trout or maybe a grayling, but that is not their preferred fish. It doesn't have the same density of fat that a sockeye or a silver salmon are going to have, so it's not going to be as beneficial for them when they're trying to pack on those pounds for hibernation.
Thanks for that information, Brooklyn. Brooks River is one of the best places in the world to watch brown bears fishing for salmon, and it's accessible to everybody with an internet connection where we're watching the bear cams on explore.org. But we also got several questions about, bears, the animals themselves. How do they make a living? A little bit about their behavior and physiology. So maybe we can talk a little bit now about some of the basics of bears in particular. Bears are mammals, just like us. But we had some interesting questions coming in from a few elementary school students in Columbia Elementary, all in second grade. Saul was asking, do bears hold their breath underwater? Can you explain a little bit about why they wouldn't be able to breathe underwater without holding their breath?
Well, bears do not have gills, and that would be the way that they would be able to breathe underwater. So they hold their breath just like people. And most bears don't really enjoy going underwater to fish, but some will snorkel and kind of stick their head under the water as they're looking for fish that they could catch. But there are a few special bears that will actually dive to the bottom of the river to pick up scraps or pieces of salmon carcasses that, especially towards the end of the season, when it's not as easy to catch live fish, they'll be able to go and grab pieces. But most bears don't spend a whole lot of time with their faces underwater unless they are looking for a fish to catch. That's a great question, Saul.
And Jasmine was wondering, how do bears stay warm?
Well, I wish I had a built-in fur coat just like bears, especially as fall starts to kick in. But bears have a really dense fur coat. So that's going to help repel water when they are fishing in the Brooks River or in other places and streams in Katmai. But they also have a thick layer of fat. That's one of the benefits of eating a diet that consists of salmon that's so full of that rich fat, and that's going to allow them to put more of that weight on their body. And so having more fat is going to help them stay warm, especially when they are fishing in the cold waters of rivers or streams in Katmai. And once we get into winter, as bears are preparing for hibernation, that's going to allow their bodies to stay warm as well.
And then Violet was wondering, what do bears need to live?
Well, bears, just like people, require just a few things. They're going to need food. So bears in Katmai are typically eating salmon or berries, potentially other small mammals, and then sedge grasses too. And those are all going to provide the bear's primary diet. Bears are also going to need shelter, especially when it comes to hibernation. They're going to need a place where they can stay safe and cozy while they are preparing and sleeping through winter. Bears are also going to need either bears to play with if they're younger, or protection. If they are a cub, they'll need a sow to help be there for them. But then as they grow, they are going to learn how to defend themselves. But bears, just like people, require food and a shelter to be able to survive.
And we, at Brooks River, we're able to see a gathering of bears that's somewhat unique. You don't really see a lot of this happening in other habitats where brown bears live because there's not a very rich concentration of food like the salmon that spawn and migrate through Brooks River. So this concentration of bears that we see at Brooks River really does give us the opportunity to explore some of the different ways that they look and they behave. And Sophia from fifth grade at St. Leo School was wondering, what things do we use to find bears and track them? And Sophia, bears at Brooks River don't have any tracking collars on them or ear tags, for instance, that would help us to track and identify them. Basically, we have to look more closely at the individual bears and identify them based on their inherited and acquired traits. And inherited traits are, those characteristics that are passed from biological parents to their offspring. So if you saw me standing next to my parents, for instance, you would see a lot of similarities. You'd see some similarities in hair color, skin tone, facial features, for instance. And some of those traits are passed on, through brown bears as well. So we can, when you look at a mother brown bear and then you see a cub, especially after it grows and becomes separated from its mother, you can sometimes see some of those similarities between mother and her offspring. So inherited physical traits are things like ear shape, for instance, in brown bears, or maybe the big humps that they have on their back. We'll be talking about this bear later on in the broadcast, number 909, but she's a great example of a bear that looks just like her mother. And then this big bear, number 856. So he inherited maybe some behavioral traits that will help him to survive and do so very well. Brem, who's in New Mexico, homeschooling, he was wondering, how big do the bears get? So when we're talking about inherited physical traits, that's something that that brown bears in Katmai National Park have the ability to do. They inherit some pretty good genes that allow them to grow really, really large. And they also have a lot of food that allows them to grow really large. The biggest bear that I've ever seen is this one right here. This is number 747. He is a tank. He's about 1,400 pounds. So he's a real giant of a brown bear. And not all bears in Katmai get as big as him, but many of the fully grown adult males that we see at Brooks River are going to weigh over 1,000 pounds at the end of September and early October. So really, really big, massive animals. So they have these inherited physical traits. So some of those ear shapes that we can see, body size that we can see, but they also have inherited behavioral traits as well. And this includes things like instincts that would allow them to find food and also survive times when they don't have food, such as hibernation, for instance. We did get actually several questions about or related to hibernation. Cole from Quail Hollow Elementary asked, what do bears do when they hibernate? And do they sleep the entire time? So when bears are hibernating, really what they're doing is they're saving energy conserving energy as much as possible so they can survive without food and water. When they're in the den, bears, what they're doing is mostly just resting. Their metabolism, their energy expenditures is much reduced compared to the summertime, and they don't eat, they don't drink, they don't even pee or poop. So really, what they're doing in the den is just resting, and saving their energy as much as possible to try to get through the time period in the wintertime when there's very little food available to them. And they do sleep, most of that time, but they can get up and they can be active during the winter if necessary. So they can still stand up even though they are technically in a hibernation mode. They can still walk around even though they are in a hibernation mode. And related to hibernation as well, one of these inherited behavioral traits, uh, Combry from fourth grade in Carver Elementary was asking, how does a bear know what time it is and when it's close to a time to go into hibernation? Each day we kind of feel a little tired and sleepy at the end of the day, and bears feel those same things as well. So at nighttime, they tend to be a little less active than us in Katmai National Park. So, or compared to us in Katmai, so they will still sleep at night just like us. But it seems like towards the end of the summer, their bodies are triggered to shift into more of a hibernative mode. And I think that's dependent on the amount of daylight that they're experiencing. So in late summer, when we have the nights start to grow longer and days become shorter, then that triggers some internal changes inside of bears that helps them to know it's close to hibernation time. When they're inside of the den, though, they're really not experiencing a lot of daylight. A lot of their dens are covered over by a thick layer of snow in the wintertime. So they also have just a cycle that's regulated by their brain and their bodies that helps to tell them about what time of the year it happens to be. So they know when it's appropriate for them to start to wake up and get out of their dens. So they have, a lot of external cues that they can that trigger when they go into hibernation, and also some internal cues that can tell them when it's a good time to exit the den. And those are a few things about inherited traits in bears. But Brooklyn, I think you have some information to share with us about acquired traits, those things that bears learn or get over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so bears, just like people, are going to change in appearance a little bit as they grow. Um, Bears could gain scars just like people. They could gain weight or lose weight, and those are going to change their physical appearance. They're still going to be the same bear, but they are going to have new things that help us identify them or recognize them based on what experiences they are having while they're on the river, just like people. Acquired behavioral traits are going to be things like learning fishing techniques or how to handle themselves on the river, whether that's if they're going to be a dominant bear or a more submissive bear. These are all things that they are going to learn to be able to do well and make a living, and ultimately pack on those pounds for winter. So Braden from Carver Elementary asked how the bears learn to catch salmon. So bears are going to learn by seeing and by doing. As cubs, bears are going to be watching their mother catch salmon. They're going to see her fishing styles, if she uses the lower river, if she maybe is a snorkeler or she dives under the water to get fish. Or maybe they're even going to see their mother utilizing the falls, like the bears that we just saw in that clip. They then will begin to learn how to fish for themselves alongside their mother. As they get older, they will begin catching salmon on their own or picking up scraps of salmon along the river. And then once a cub has been emancipated or kicked out by their mother, it becomes that bear's sole job to figure out, how do I catch salmon on my own? So bears will typically start with a dash and grab technique. They're going to see a salmon and they're going to run after it because that's what makes the most sense. I see the thing I want and I'm going to go try to get it. It's not the easiest way to catch a fish, but as young bears, they may not have the opportunity to use some of those better fishing spots, those prime fishing spots that bears that are a little bit older or more dominant may have the opportunity to use. But the longer a bear works at fishing, the better they're going to get. practice is going to make perfect. But there are some bears that have some natural giftings. As they've watched their mother use specific techniques, especially fishing the lip, they may show that they are a little bit better at doing that than others. It's still not going to be an easy job, but they may have a leg up on the competition. Liesel, who is a homeschool student, asked how much salmon do bears eat? So they're using these fishing techniques, and now we want to see how well are they doing. And some bears can eat over 40 salmon a day. Right now, bears are fishing nonstop in preparation for hibernation. This is called hyperphagia. So we've entered this phase where bears are no longer eating because they are hungry, though they're still going to be hungry and trying to suppress those feelings. But now their bodies have stopped telling them that they're full. So normally when we're eating a meal, at some point we go, oh, I do not need to eat anymore. I've eaten too much. But right now, bears' bodies are not saying that. They're saying keep eating. So bears are going to be eating as much as they can, all in preparation to try and get as much fat on their bodies for winter. So bears are going to be eating 40 salmon or more as they prep and try to get ready. But all of this is going on to prepare, and ultimately we'll get to celebrate this preparation through Fat Bear Week. So we've got some of the contenders for Fat Bear Week that we're going to talk about, and some of these inherited and learned traits to these specific bears. So one of the first bears we're going to chat about is 128 Grazer.
Yeah, she's a great bear to talk about. One of my favorite bears to watch at Brooks River. One of her inherited traits that I see in her is her big blonde ears. Grazer's a bear whose mother and aunt also had large blonde ears. Grazer's also a defensive mother bear, and bears have different personalities and tolerances for one another. And Grazer's mom was noted to be somewhat defensive as well. So perhaps Grazer inherited a little bit of her mother's defensive characteristics. So those are a couple of those inherited traits that I notice in her. Talking about the learned or acquired traits in Grazer, I think she's one of the most skilled bears fishing the lip of Brooks Falls. And she was introduced to Brooks River by her mother, but her mother didn't fish the lip of the falls. So again, the lip is the top of the falls where the bears stand and they can wait for the salmon to jump towards them and they catch the fish in their mouths. And her mother, from what I saw, didn't do that. So when Grazer was a cub, they fished in different areas of Brooks River. So while many bears utilize fishing techniques that their mothers also used, bears also have the ability to learn by watching others and trying new things. And that's an important way that they gain experience and they gain skills. And that's likely how Grazer was able to fish the lip of the falls. Right now, Brooklyn, though, there's one small bear on the cameras that we've been seeing, especially at the river mouth on the lower river cameras. We've been seeing quite a lot, and that happens to be Holly's cub. What can you tell us a little bit about her cub and some of those behavioral traits that we can see in them?
Yes, well, right off the bat, we can see this cub has some light coloration, and that is a classic 435 Holly. She's always been a very light colored bear, so we're able to see some of that, and we'll see if this bear continues to have that light coat or if ultimately they grow into a darker coat. Holly has always had a tendency for her cubs to have lighter coats, though in her last litter, she had one that was very blonde and one that was very dark. So we'll see what this bear ultimately carries with it. But we also see this bear learning to be incredibly independent and brave. That's another trait that many of Holly's cubs have portrayed in the past. An independence and a fearlessness, even when battling a porcupine, like this cub did at some and ultimately received quite a few quills in the paw. And not being afraid to try to introduce themselves to other bears. Even this season, we saw this cub playing with other cubs, trying to play with subadults, and relatively fearless, having its sow behind it. So we've definitely been able to see this independence and confidence that's been instilled by and learned from 4 through 5 Holly. So, Besa from Miranda School asked, why do spring cubs, or first year cubs, have dark fur and it gets lighter as they get to be an older cub, then darkens again as they become a subadult? So it's interesting to see, but bears are going to have coats that are all different shades. So some bears are ultimately going to have a dark coat all throughout their lives. Some bears are going to start with that dark coat that they have as a spring cub and then transition into having a lighter coat. And seasonally, we will also see bear coats change. Typically, bears are going to emerge from their dens with a lighter coat, and then as winter comes, their coats are going to darken. But it really just depends on the physical traits that those bears are carrying from their parent bears. And then Laura from St. Leo's School asked, where does Holly hang out the most? So as we've been able to see on the cams this season, she has spent a lot of time in the lower river and on the beach. So that's where she and her cub have spent the most amount of time. It's easier for her to fish down there, especially with her cub, not having to worry about other larger bears potentially posing a threat to her cub. And so that's kind of been her primary spot, hanging out there. And then she has traveled a little bit to other spots in the park, but come back and has now positioned herself as the queen of the lower river. Another bear that we find to be a really interesting story is 151 and seeing his kind of up and coming nature on the river.
Yes, 151 Walker's another great bear to watch. He is a bear that was also introduced to Brooks River by his mother. And when I look at him and I'm looking for some of those acquired or learned traits in Walker, I see like Grazer before, that fishing the lip of the falls and the far side of Brooks Falls was not something that his mother did, but that's definitely something that 151 Walker does. So he's learned over time to fish those locations, even though his mother wasn't able to compete for those fishing spots. Inherited traits in Walker, though, that I see compared to his mother, and we don't. His mother no longer visits the river. We don't know what happened to her, but Walker has a very conical shaped face, so it really kind of narrows and tapers like a cone. So he's a very sort of narrow muzzle, kind of a skinny muzzle. And that's similar to his mother. And while this photo right here is a late summer photo of Walker, in early summer, his fur color is much lighter brown. And that's also very similar to his mother. Walker has some behavioral traits that are somewhat interesting to take a look at. And a few questions related to those that got submitted. Yaroslav was wondering, and he's from 5th grade, Miranda School, how rare is it that a bear attacks another bear? And we've been seeing Walker being more willing recently to actually sort of stand up and try to acquire those good fishing spots at Brooks Falls. When he was a younger bear, he was much more likely just to sort of like say, hey, I don't want to try this. It seems like it's going to be a bit difficult and I don't want to get in a fight. I'm just going to keep my distance. But now, since he's a real big guy, it seems like he's more likely to stand his ground and acquire those more preferred fishing spots. But it's also not likely that bears are going to get into fights because bears really want to avoid physical conflict as much as possible. They want to avoid fights because there's a risk to both bears if they end up getting in a fight. So they could get, both of them could get severely injured. So they usually use a variety of body postures, head positions, ear positions, vocalizations to communicate which bear is more dominant and which one is subordinate, which one should yield space. And that's we're seeing Walker showing more of those characteristics of a dominant bear, directly approaching other bears, for instance, and telling them to get out of the way just because he's a real big guy and you need to leave him some space. But Walker was a more tolerant bear of other bears when he was younger. Emma from 3rd grade at Lakes Elementary was asking, are all these bears friendly? And sometimes yes, and a lot of times no. It depends, I think, a lot on how well fed they are. But the bears, definitely can change their personalities over time. And we definitely see that with Walker. He was a much more tolerant bear when he was younger. He loved to play with other bears when he was younger. And we don't really see him doing that very much right now. So a lot of times younger bears can be more friendly with other bears and seek out playful opportunities and want to play fight or spar with other bears. But we often don't see that with the older adult males like 151 Walker. Uh, and Arian was asking and he's in fifth grade, you know, when males go to the falls, why don't they attack each other for their food? Well, it's because, you know, they want to avoid conflict. They want to avoid getting injured, and they can do that through their system of communication. So it's not bears live in a very competitive world, and they compete for fishing spots, access to food resources, access to mating opportunities, but they don't always, rarely need to fight for access to those resources that they need to survive. So again, they're using their ability to communicate with one another and settle their disputes without having to resort to a fight. So when you're watching the cameras, look for that. Look for one bear to approach another, but look for those bears mostly to settle their disputes without having to fight one another, because they can read each other's body language just like we can, maybe without necessarily having to speak to one another. One more bear, though, that we want to talk about, Brooklyn, is another fun bear to watch, a young bear that was raised along Brooks River, and that happens to be number 909.
Yes, and 909 is a perfect example of just these inherited physical traits. We're able to see those same very fluffy blonde ears that her mother, 409 Bead Nose, had, and then even a similar face shape to that sow. In all actuality, she looks almost like a mini me of her mother. So she's inherited a lot of those same physical traits. Um, when we're looking at learned behaviors, we are able to see her ability to utilize the lip of the falls. And her mom was classically a lip fisher, actually one of the most um, well known and easily identifiable bears to utilize the lip. Even people taking pictures. Most likely, the bear that was seen on the lip of the falls was in fact 409. But just because her mom was able to fish the lip well does not mean that she was going to be able to do that. Just like when we are toddlers and we can see our parents walking, we still have to learn how to walk ourselves. So 909 has been learning to fish the lip and is often seen there, and she's getting really good. So she was able to learn that behavior from her mom, but has now been able to really take that upon herself, and it's now becoming not only her mom's legacy but hers as well. And then Audrey from Lakeside Elementary asked, why are the bear's ears so much lighter in color? So just like I was saying about 909, this is one of those traits that's going to be passed down. And some bears are going to have lighter colored ears, while other bears are not. We were able to see 909's ears as well as 128 Grazer's ears as well, are going to have that light, fluffy look to them. But there are other bears that don't have that same kind of real fluffy, light colored ear. So it's just another one of those traits that we may be able to see inherited from generations of bears.
And those are a few of our Fat Bear Week bears, and you can vote on those bears starting on September 30th this year. Uh, so it'll be, I think, a wonderful competition for everyone to decide who they think is the fattest bear of 2020, which one gained the most weight or gained weight most impressively based on their body size or other life history characteristics. So I'm looking forward to seeing how everyone votes this year. And we have, Brooklyn, several more, or actually many more questions to try to get through. But just to try to wrap up our main part of our conversation today, I wanted to say that the brown bears of Brooks River really do show us that there's more than one way to make a living. Many of the physical traits that we see in these bears are inherited, but a bear's acquired traits, like their fishing techniques, are also an extremely important component of their overall survival. And each bear that we see at Brooks River is a unique individual, just as as unique as you and I and any of our pets that we might have living with us. So a bear's combination of acquired and inherited traits provides it with the tools and skills necessary to survive in a very tough and competitive environment. So thanks for everyone who has submitted their questions. We know that we couldn't fit all of your questions into our the main part of our conversation today, but Brooklyn and I are going to try to get through many of the rest of the questions during the next several minutes. So if you can stick with us, that would be just wonderful. We actually had 3 questions about birds, Brooklyn. Several different students were wondering about those. You want to take us through a few of those questions?
Absolutely. So Ellie from Fernhill Academy asked, do the bears ever eat the seagulls? So the birds that we have primarily seen on the cams are a type of gull, but they're not seagulls because we're not on the ocean. But I have never seen a bear eat a gull. But I think it's because they have access to a very easily accessible resource in the salmon. They know how to fish for the salmon. There are a lot around them, so they're not having to fight as hard or compete over the birds. I think the birds would be a little bit harder to get. Cameron from Lakes Elementary asked that same thing. Why don't the bears eat the birds? As well as Noah from St. Leo. So again, the birds are not their primary food source. It's not something that's going to give them a whole lot of calories. And I sure wouldn't know how to try and catch one of these gulls. And I don't think the bears know either.
The bears are quick animals, but they're not as quick as a gull. So I think it's the bears know that. They're like, it's probably just not worth it. There's a lot of easier meals available to them. One question that I missed earlier in our chat, I wanted to get to it earlier, but I missed it accidentally, was about cubs and when do bears have cubs? And that was asked by Theone, a sophomore at Central High School. So bears have cubs in the middle of winter while they're actually hibernating, and they're the only mammal that can give birth and nurse their young while hibernating. It's a pretty remarkable thing. So when we look at some of the adult females at Brooks River, like Grazer, for instance, or many of the other single adult females that are walking around, there's the single adult females that we see at Brooks River are eating not only to support their own survival in the winter, but they could be getting ready to give birth this winter. Generally around the end of January and early February is when bear cubs are born. And their mothers are going to give birth without eating or drinking. So that those fat reserves that they gain during the summertime are especially important to help support the birth of their cubs during the winter. Giovanni from 2nd grade in Columbia Elementary was wondering why don't the bears fall when the water rushes past them? And that's a good question because it's the water at the falls is very strong. The rocks are very slippery. I've been in the water at Brooks Falls at a time of the year, I should clarify, I should say for sure, when there aren't bears around. I'm not going to go into the water when there are bears around. That would be foolish, of course. So I don't do that, but I kind of explore the area when there aren't bears around. And the water is swift, it's strong, the rocks are slippery, so it can be hard for me as a 2-legged creature to walk through the water there. But bears, you have to remember, are much bigger than the average person, so they have a lot more body weight to hold them down. And they also have 4 really big paws that are really the size of dinner plates. So they're kind of locked in with 4-wheel drive, and they're able to navigate the waters around the falls much easier than a human would due to their size and their strength and the 4 paws that they can place on the ground at the same time.
So Eager from Carver School in 5th grade asked, were the 2 big bears playing or fighting? And it's possible that either were happening. We will typically be able to know that bears are fighting because it is loud. It's very loud, and it's definitely not playful. Typically, you're going to see bears that are very aggressive when they are fighting. When bears are playing, it's typically a lot quieter. You're not hearing the same kind of vocalizations. And the bears kind of let each other take turns. Sometimes it's them practicing how to establish dominance. Sometimes it truly is trying to get out some of that energy. Um, so typically, we are able to identify if a bear is playing or fighting, but sometimes it looks very similar because oftentimes it really is just preparation for the future and what they'll need to do if they ever try to challenge another bear that's in a more dominant position.
And Carter from Columbia Elementary asked, where do bears sleep? And they sleep pretty much anywhere that they feel comfortable. So it depends on your comfort level. If you're a bear, it depends on your comfort level around other bears, and the maybe the weather conditions. For instance, if it's very stormy, then they might go into areas where they can find some cover to protect them from the storm. But often they don't. Sometimes they'll sleep out in the open, even though it may be cold and raining. Sometimes bears will even sleep right in the middle of the river. They'll just find a place where they can put their head on a rock or on a tuft of grass. We've been seeing that with certain bears at Brooks River this fall. So they'll sleep wherever they happen to feel comfortable. They don't necessarily need to go to a specific spot each and every day. It just happens to be where they're comfortable and where they can stay warm enough. And for some bears are large enough, they can lay right in the water and even take a nap there.
So Kendall from Lakes Elementary, oh no, Enrique from Columbia Elementary asked, how long are bear claws? So bear claws can be 4 to 5 inches long, sometimes even longer, depending on the bear. And they grow like fingernails. So our fingernails grow, and if we don't cut them, they grow longer and longer. So bears' nails are going to grow, and as they age, they're slowly going to um, wear down. So the bear's nails are not going to be as long, their claws are not going to be as long as they were as their claws were growing. But they could be 4 to 5 inches. So that's still a hefty claw.
This is
Yeah,
an
just
image
like
of some bear claws right here. Yeah, this is the front paw a uh, of a of a brown bear. Their claws on the front are much longer than the ones on the back, but yeah, several inches long. They're great tools at digging and grasping things. So wonderful, wonderful tools for bears. Kendall from third grade, Lakes Elementary, was wondering, do male or female bears do more of the hunting? And it's probably about equal for most bears. Only mother bears raise cubs, so male brown bears don't have any role in raising cubs. It's only the females that raise cubs. So a male bear will go and he'll hunt, he'll fish, he'll gather food as much as possible for himself, and a mother bear has to do that for herself, but also her cubs. So it seems to be distributed a bit equally, I think, between male and female bears. It's really hard to tell which one does more hunting. I think it probably is about average.
Aiden from Columbia Elementary asked, what do bears eat if they can't fish? So bears, when they first emerge from the den, are typically going to be eating grasses, sometimes bark, or over-seasoned berries, so berries that have gone through the winter and were not eaten before bears were able to go into their dens. Then once bears have gotten to the streams, if they aren't eating salmon, they may be finding small mammals like Arctic ground squirrels. But then one of their primary food sources is going to be berries. So in late summer or early fall, they're going to start eating high bush cranberries or blueberries, watermelon berries. They're going to be finding all sorts of berries that they're able to supplement their diet with.
And Jay from Lakes Elementary was wondering, how do the workers or rangers clean the Brooks Falls area to make sure it's safe for bears? And actually, rangers don't do really anything to prepare the area for the bears. They're wild animals, so they have to survive using their own instincts, their skills, and some of the learned traits that they gain through their experiences in their lives, and it can be very difficult for them. So they live in a very competitive and tough environment. But in national parks protect not only certain species of animals, but also the processes that support those species as well. And generally, nothing is done in national parks to help individual animals in certain locations.
So this question goes really well with that. Audrey from Lakes Elementary asked if the bears ever get fed by workers if they're not eating enough fish. So just like you mentioned about not cleaning up habitats, the rangers are not going to be supplementing the diets of bears. The bears are following those natural processes, and so they're going to be responsible for feeding themselves, for finding the food that they need, and rangers are not going to be interfering. The only time that park rangers may interfere is if there is a human caused something. So if there are, trash that is accumulating, rangers are going to be picking that up, so bears are not going to be eating it. Or if there was some sort of human caused injury to a bear, rangers then might intervene to do something. But otherwise, we are letting the bears do what they do to try to keep them as wild as possible.
And Parab from Miranda School asked, what happens if a bear doesn't eat enough and hibernates? Well, it's going to have a harder time, surviving if it doesn't have enough fat reserves. Fat really is the fuel that helps bears survive winter hibernation. They rely on their body fat more than any other tissue or any other substance when they're inside of their dens. So if a bear doesn't have enough fat reserves when it goes into its den, it may have to start to draw energy from its muscle tissue, and that's going to make it maybe weaker when it comes out of the den. So it's really important for bears to eat enough food in late summer and early fall so they have enough fat reserves to sustain them through that hibernation time.
So Isley from Carver Elementary asked the question that we kind of answered earlier from Giovanni, but asked, the water is flowing very fast. How do the bears stay in one place without moving? So like, Mike said earlier, they have so much weight because they are a four-legged creature that stands on all four legs. So they're going to have a stronger posture than us trying to stand on two legs. I have also walked in the Brooks River when bears were not there, and I fell over a couple times and actually filled my waders with water, which made it even harder to walk. So I think that the bears have really got it figured out because I did not do very well trying to walk on my own.
There are many people I think that share that same experience, Brooklyn. So you're not the only one uh, who's had it. Just a couple more questions that we'll try to get to before we conclude our broadcast today. Ben, who's actually a senior at Marion High School, wrote in and said, "I've been reading a little about brown fat and its relationship to hibernation. Do brown bears at Katmai utilize brown fat? And if so, how? And if not, is there a substitute?" And Ben, I don't really know a whole lot about the differences between like brown fat and white fat tissue, but in general, there are a couple of different types of fat that we have in our bodies. It seems like brown fat is something that all mammals have, and it's a specialized type of fat that's deposited only in certain areas of the body. And burning brown fat is a good way to help generate body heat. So some mammals may be utilizing that more often in hibernation than others. While white fat, for instance, is used as a form of energy, and it's found throughout the body, including around our organs and underneath the skin. So we have a layer of brown fat, or white fat, or underneath our skin. I wasn't able to find a whole lot of information on how bears utilize brown fat versus white fat. But one study that I was able to find is that in polar bears, they found that scientists found that as bears get fatter, their fat deposits in the body increased, all of them, including the ones around their organs, except for those around the heart. But it was the superficial fat deposits, the fat around or just underneath the skin, that increased faster than all others. And this enlarged superficial layer of adipose tissue, I think, is primarily an adaptation for increased energy storage. So again, that white fat is really the most important part of a bear's wintertime survival strategy.
So Bobby from Lakeside Elementary asked, what is the best part of your job? What do I need to do to get your job? And I would say the best part of working as a park ranger, especially in Katmai National Park, is living in a place where your backyard is a postcard. Being surrounded by the natural world, waking up and seeing mountains right out your back door, and then being surrounded by um, phenomenal wildlife like these awesome bears and getting to talk to people about them every single day is definitely my favorite part of the job. And to get a job like this, first of all, having a passion for the outdoors and for wild animals is a great start. You could go and study animal biology or any other degree that would allow you to be learning about the outdoors, how to manage recreational areas. There's so many different positions in national parks too. It's not just park ranger positions that are interpretive like mine. You can do maintenance in national parks. You can go into law enforcement in national parks. You can go into archaeology and studying the peoples that lived in national parks for years before they became national parks or monuments. So there's so many things that you can do, even outside of just talking about the animals or the places themselves. So whatever you're passionate about, if you truly want to work in a national park, we can figure out a way to get you plugged in.
Very well said. Uh, Lots of great opportunities in national parks, and it was great to get everyone's questions about brown bears and giving us Brooklyn and I the opportunity to learn more about these animals and share some of our experience with everybody. Brooklyn, thanks so much today for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
And my name is Mike Fitz with Explore.org. Please vote in Fat Bear Week this year, which runs September 30th through October 6th. Please join us for other live events on Explore.org that'll be happening throughout the winter and, of course, next year with Bear Cam next summer. Have a great day, everyone, and never stop learning.